All right, this week we're going to be talking about topography and site work in Revit. And this is actually going to span across a couple of weeks because it is a fairly large topic. And at the end of that discussion on how to do this in Revit, we're going to have some in-depth discussion about how to put together a site plan. The purpose for doing site work is really two when you're using Revit. One of them is to create the site plan. The other one, probably just important, is to give yourself a platform in which you can do some site work, like for 3D rendering, for example. The outside of the house is always impressive in a rendering, but it's always made much more impressive by doing plantings and topography and those outside infrastructure things, sort of to act as a background to your creation. One project in particular that does a nice job of demonstrating that exact thing is this one here. This is one that's available under the course resources section on the LMS, and so feel free to get in and take a look at it. But this rendering does a nice job of demonstrating what I'm talking about. You can see that this student opted to put in, obviously the plantings are impressive, but also the topography is complex. So we have a driveway that's sort of flat at the bottom of all the slopes, and then the topography just sort of slopes up and away from the house. And so lots and lots of trees around it to sort of like fill in that background. And then beyond that, she is using imagery to sort of flesh out the back. It wouldn't have required much in this case. You could have just had a sky back through there, but she chose to use sort of a forest background. And we'll talk about some of those settings when we get into our Revit or our rendering module a little bit later in the semester. So we're going to start by beginning a new project, and we'll go ahead and use the architectural template for this. I suppose you could use the residential one as well. It has a lot of the same settings, but just to kind of keep everybody on the same page, let's all use that architectural template, and then just go ahead and save this as Unit 7. We'll just kind of follow the same process that we've been using, or we're calling it Unit 7 now. If this is a future reference to this as an older video, I call it whatever unit we're on. But in this 2023, we're going to call it Unit 7. And once that's open, the first thing I want to talk about is view range, because view range in terms of the site work is really important because, and you may have already gathered this, we want to be able to see the entire site on one view. So let's go ahead and just take a look at the site plan view. We don't have anything in here yet, obviously, but let's go ahead and take a look at the view range for site plan. And let's contrast that against the default settings that we're going to have for most of our other views, our plan type views. So you can see in this case there's already something that jumps out as being very different. The top is set to the associated level, which in this case is level 1, and the offset is 200 feet. So we're actually allowing the view to start way above what we would anticipate being the actual objects that we're going to see in the view, 200 feet. Now obviously if we're going to be building this site plan someplace outside of that range, we need to make sure we adjust this accordingly. If you, for example, have a huge mountain on your site and it goes up 300, 400 feet, maybe there's a cliff, you want to be able to see that, and so we need to adjust our view range accordingly. The same thing is true for the bottom, and usually on a site plan view, we're going to set the bottom to the level below or some other level that is going to allow us to see the depth. And in some cases, we might have a depression that we're going to need to make sure that we can see lower than the current view. So ideally, we're going to set it to some level that's down below, and you might have to create that level just for this purpose. Or you can set it to unlimited, and that's usually going to be my preference, is to set both the view primary range bottom as unlimited and the view depth as unlimited. So that's going to set our site plan up for an unlimited ability to see high and low objects, but also to select objects, and you're going to see why that's important in a minute when we start getting into modifying the topography. So some of the things we're going to cover in this lesson, and again I'll repeat that this is going to be a two-part lesson. The first part we're going to be talking about creating a new topo object, and then to do that we're actually going to bring in a CAD file. So this sort of circles back around to some discussions that we had when we were doing our surveying work. You can create a topography out of the survey work that we do by collecting points through any number of different methods, pulling those points into either AutoCAD or Civil 3D, which is essentially the same thing, and then taking that 3D topo that it generates and linking that or inserting it or importing it into a Revit project. So I do want to point out that Revit is usually not used for civil applications. We're only going to scratch the surface on the civil applications within Revit, because usually a lot of that work is done in another application that's more well suited for it, either Civil 3D or InfraWorks. But that being said, Revit does have some fairly robust tools for civil work, and so for a residential project, certainly plenty robust to do most work in that way. So the processes we're going to cover today: we're going to create a new project out of an existing topo CAD file. Then we're going to link that topo project, that topo Revit project, into another Revit project, which is the one we're going to use to create the building. So essentially, we're going to try to keep the topography separate from the building, two separate projects that are linked together. And that's pretty common to do. When we're working on a building, we may not want to clutter it up with a bunch of topography. Now, I'm not saying you have to do it that way for your final project. If you want to just bring the topo, create the topo right in your final project, that is fine. It's going to work just fine. But for this operation, we're going to do the link operation just for practice, because this is commonly used, linking two projects together. Very common to do in a Revit environment workflow. Once we have those two things linked, we need to make sure that they're aligned vertically so that they agree with one another. One's not hundreds of feet above the other one or below. And then we're going to link it the other way too. So we'll open up our topo project and link our building model into that. We often do that with X-references and AutoCAD as well. We link them both ways. We X-reference them both directions so that we're sure that they align and agree with one another. So let's jump right in. Let's go ahead and create a topo from a CAD file. We've gone ahead and started our new project. This is going to be what we're calling Unit 7. And let's just take a quick look at the CAD file we're going to be bringing in here. You've already downloaded this into the same folder that you're working in, hopefully. If not, make sure you get that done. And also download the house file, the one called house.rvt, into the same folder. All right, so this is essentially a series of topo lines and a property boundary with some annotations. You may or may not be aware of this already, but you can actually look at AutoCAD files in a 3D view. And so if we do that, we can sort of rotate around this thing in AutoCAD even and see that there is a couple of things. There's some two-dimensional imagery down at the bottom, and then there's an actual topo with the elevations assigned to each one of these contour lines. And that is what we're going to bring into our Revit file next. So let's go ahead and bring this site plan in. We're going to import it. So this will be a one-off. This is not a link. This is an import. So we're going to do the Insert tab and not link, but over here to the Insert things right here, import rather. So we're going to import CAD in this case. We're going to be looking for a DWG file. And to do this, we need to make sure that everything is in the same folder for obvious reasons, I think. So when we go to import CAD, you're probably going to have to browse to the folder that you saved your project in, and hopefully you're going to see this topo.dwg in there. We'll go ahead and select that, and let's just take a quick look at some of the settings we should be paying attention to before we just bring this thing in, because these can make a difference. For the colors part, we're going to go ahead and preserve those. Sometimes it's easier to see the color on a CAD file so you don't mistake that geometry with the stuff in Revit, which is typically black and white. So the colors are fine. Revit's not going to care what color they are. It's going to create the topo out of them regardless. The layers, we're going to go ahead and leave on as visible, we'll set that to visible. We'll keep them visible. The import units, we're going to leave that at auto detect. You can also set that to feet, but sometimes it gets a little bit confused by that. So, and we do too, right? Because AutoCAD uses the default units are inches, and in Revit, the default units are feet. And so let's go ahead and give Autodesk an opportunity to figure out the compatibility between the two drawing types. We'll leave that at auto. For positioning, and this is just sort of the initial place it's going to place the CAD file, we're going to go ahead and change that center to center. We really don't have anything in this project yet, so there's nothing to really align it with. So auto center to center is just going to place it right in the middle of all of our elevation markers, and that seems like a good place to do this. By the way, we're doing this in the site plan view. This is where we're going to be placing this thing initially. We will go ahead and uncheck the box current view only if it's checked. Make sure that it is cleared. You clear that box so that this CAD file can be visible in multiple views. We'll go ahead and click open at this point. It's going to bring that CAD file in. It says some elements were lost during import, ActiveX, and some proprietary components cannot be imported. Fine. Let's just go ahead and get that in there, and here it is. There's our CAD file. It brought it in just fine. Let's go ahead and take a look in a 3D view, see what we see. Looks very similar to what we saw in the CAD file, but you can see that the alignment vertically might need some adjustment because it brought it in at level 1. That is way down here, and our topo surface is way up here, which tells me one thing, that the topo lines themselves are probably set above the 0. So the topography, the properties of each one of those topo lines is probably set to maybe 100 feet or something like that. For now, we're going to leave that alone. We're just going to go ahead and create a topo surface out of that just as it is. To do this, we're going to go to the Massing and Site tab. Haven't spent a lot of time here, so this might be a little unfamiliar to you. The next thing we're going to do is click on the Topo Surface tool. And specifically what we're going to use is, you guessed it, Create from Import. Let's go ahead and see what this has in the drop-down. Anytime you have a drop-down, you've never used it before, always a good idea to pop that thing down to see what your options are. In this case, we're going to select an import instance. We do have one of those we can select. We could also specify a point file if this was in a tabular format or comma separated text file or something like that with all the individual points. That's something else that we could bring in. And by the way, do we have one of those that we could reference? Absolutely we do. We collected a whole bunch of points when we did our surveying last semester. And so theoretically, we could find that text file on those data collectors, download them, and import them into Revit, and Revit can make a topo surface out of that as well. But for now, we're going to go ahead and select Import Instance, and you can see that we do have an instance to select, right? And you can see Revit is asking, select a 3D import symbol to add the surface. So I'm just going to select this, and now I get this list of possible layers that I can include for Revit to evaluate. So Revit can be easily confused. We have property boundaries in that Revit, or in that CAD file. We did have some annotations as well. So we want to make sure that we are only using the contour line layers in this case. So what we need to do is uncheck those things that we don't want included in the evaluation, because Revit is going to make a surface out of this thing, and the more noise you throw at it, the more confused Revit can be. It just so happens that I went out and looked ahead of time at the CAD file. I checked what layer those contour lines are on, and they happen to be on C Topo Major and C Topo Minor. And for anybody that doesn't believe me, all you have to do is go to the CAD file and click, and you can see right over here, C Topo Minor N for the sort of orange looking ones, and the green ones are on C Topo Major N. So those are the two that we're going to use for creation. Best way to do this is just click Check None, and then we'll just select those two layers as our source for the topo surface. Click OK, and it did create those. So it created them right over the top of the original CAD file, which can be a little bit confusing. So the next step needs to be, since we're done with that CAD file, either to delete it, right? That's one way to do it, but a better option would just be to hide it. So we're going to go ahead and circle around here and see if we can collect that thing. We're not actually done. We have to click this Finish button, so we'll do that next. And then let's go ahead and hide this DWG import in this view and in the site plan view. Okay, so make sure you're not selecting your new topo surface. You're just selecting the CAD file. You can see right here, topo DWG when it's selected. We'll right click, hide in view, elements. Okay, so now we're just looking at our topo surface that we just created. Who knew creating a topo in Revit was going to be so easy? Well, we're going to look at some ways to manually create a topo surface later on, and then also how to edit an imported topo surface like this one. So now that we have our topo surface created, the next thing we want to do is place our building, our house project, into the topo someplace, right? So we got a little bit of work to do yet. We're going to go ahead and bring that in by linking it, not importing it. So again, make sure that you have that house Revit file downloaded into the same folder, and then go back to the Insert tab, and this time we are going to link a Revit file in. Now, if you haven't already saved the project you're working in, this topo that we called Unit 7, make sure that you do that before you do any kind of linking, because Revit's going to get really confused if you try to link it in and there's not a file to actually link it to. So you got to save it once to create that file. Then Revit can start thinking about the links and the relationships between one project and another. We're going to go ahead and bring in the one called house.rvt. You'll notice this is a fairly complicated foundation on this house intentionally, because this thing does have to be brought in and placed on a site that is sloping. So that is part of the challenge of this little demo here. So we're going to select the house, but this time for positioning we're going to say auto internal origin to internal origin. And this is basically going to make sure that the two Revit files are sort of using the same 00 point. The 00 in a Revit file is actually this guy right here in the middle. That's the origin point, unlike the little UCS icon that we get in AutoCAD. So this is the correct setting right here, and that's really the only thing you have to mess with. We're going to go ahead and just click open in this case. And it is, unfortunately, now upgrading that Revit model of the house. I forgot to upgrade that and save it. I'll try to get that done prior to deploying this thing, but it's not too long, shouldn't take too long to upgrade if yours has to. So Revit is giving us this standard warning about some stuff might not come in during the upgrade. Standard disclaimer, let's not worry about that right now. You can see that it did place that house right in the center, and this is probably not going to be where we want it, but that's okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at a 3D view and just kind of see where we're at this point. You can see that the house is actually located kind of above where the original 0 elevation is, and the reason for that is because this one was actually created with the first floor at 100 feet. So we are going to have to adjust that slightly. You can see that the roof is just barely visible above the ground level, so we are going to have to move one or the other, either the topo or the house, make some adjustments to one or the other so that they are aligned properly. So at this point we could have a conversation about which one is the more common one to have to move, and rather than dig deep into that discussion, let's just say for the sake of speed and efficiency, we're going to move the house in this case. In most cases, the topography is set at the elevation it actually is above sea level, which may or may not be important to the project. So depending on what side of this you're working on, either the topography side, the exterior pieces, or you're just concerned about the house, you might move one or the other to conform to the one you're working on. Let's go to the site plan view and let's move the house into position. And where we want this house to be is right over here. We're going to think of this sort of this northeast diagonal boundary as maybe the road out in front of this house. And so this house in this case is going to be built near the top of the site, and it's going to slope down and away from the house at the bottom over here. So we're going to have to get this thing into position. We got to first select the house to be able to move it. And you can see that I'm having a little bit of trouble getting it to highlight. I can't quite get it to highlight, but what you guys know that one thing you can do is try to tab select, and even that's given me some trouble. So what you might have to do in this case is do a crossing window selection, and even that is giving me trouble. And even switching to a 3D view, I'm not able to click on that link by default, and yours might be different. But I just want to point out something that we haven't done yet, and that is over under the selection. We're used to using this one, right? Select elements by face. We may not even read the other options in there, but one of them is select links. So make sure that you have select links clicked, and then anywhere now from the site view, from the 3D view, you should be able to select that thing. All right, so zoom in on it until you see it highlight. We'll select it, and then we're actually just gonna move it, right? You can click and drag it if you want to. That's maybe a little bit easier because this is not going to be a super precise operation that we're doing here. We're just gonna be grabbing it and dragging it up to this space right here. And we're just gonna give it a slight gap between the front of the house and the edge of the property line, just like we would if we were gonna be placing this on a developed site. So again, we're going to assume that there's a road going by here. We don't actually have one. That's okay. We can use our imaginations. But now we also have to rotate this thing so that it's oriented similarly as the site plan view. So with the house selected, I am going to use the rotate tool in this case. And so I'm just going to have, as my starting point, I'm going to move this point up into the north corner of this property, and I'm going to have it horizontal just like the house is as my start point. I'll click, and then I'll rotate this down to roughly the other edge of the property as my second point. And now my alignment is pretty darn close to the property line. So I'm just going to kind of set this in about right here. That's going to work just fine for now. We're going to have this thing set maybe 20, 30 feet back from the edge of the property line. Close enough. If we wanted to get it more accurate than that, we could certainly use a combination of detail lines or reference planes to do that. The next step is to move the house vertically so it pokes up out of the ground just enough or about where we think we're going to want it vertically. This is actually, in reality, a pretty critical step because making sure that your house aligns and is vertically at the ideal spot within the existing topography is going to reduce a tremendous amount of site work and dirt work that needs to be done. If we set that house right where it needs to go so that for example, your driveway is sloping correctly, you're correctly positioned above the sewer that's running under the street out front, all of these things kind of require a little bit of research and just evaluating what the best way to do this is. And then also, of course, if you're going to have a walkout basement, how can we place that basement floor within the ground so that a minimal amount of dirt work needs to be done and you don't have a bunch of water flowing into your basement when it rains. So to move this thing vertically, I've found the easiest way to do that is in a 3D view using the view cube. So you'll notice that when you go into a 3D view, you have a view cube and you can click on that thing and it'll actually give you a nice vertical alignment or show you kind of where this thing's at. I'm going to actually switch to this view right here. So I'm at a slight angle and we could actually kind of use our standard rotation tools to kind of get it exactly aligned with the house if we really want to. But you're going to see when you move this thing up, you're going to see it poke through the dirt, and you can kind of adjust it manually, or you can just kind of play around with the elevation settings however you'd like to. So now I'm going to move this thing up, and I'm just going to click on the move tool. I'm just going to kind of, okay, it does not like the angle I'm looking at this, so I'm just going to go ahead and switch back to this right view, and we'll just move it this way. So I'm going to go ahead and select it. Use the move tool. We'll just kind of move this thing up to approximately where we think we want it. Maybe zoom in a little bit. Obviously, I'm going to have to move this thing up more. I want to get it all the way up to where the dirt is just touching the foundation in the front. So I can make a few adjustments to the topography, which we are going to do, but this is pretty close to where I want it. Probably come up just a little bit more, just for sake of being sure that I'm up out of the dirt far enough in the front. And I think we'll call that good. So get yours pretty close, looking pretty close to what that looks like. And we'll kind of just take a closer look at this thing. Actually, I have my house. I just noticed I have my house backwards. The garage is facing toward the backyard. So stand by. I'm going to flip that around 180 degrees and we'll pick it up again from there. So just to minimize the amount of work I'm going to go ahead and place the center of the rotation kind of near the middle of the house. We'll just go ahead and hold it at a perfect right angle, flip it 180, and yeah, we're going to call that good. Let's go back to our 3D view now and see what we've got around the correct side of the house. And here we have, you can see the topography is kind of coming in and hitting just below the garage door, okay? And we're going to make some, again, as I mentioned, we're going to make some adjustments to the topography around the perimeter to kind of flesh that thing out. You're rarely going to be able to have a completely undisturbed topography. You're going to have to do some dirt work. The goal, of course, is to try to minimize that as much as possible. The final step in this project is to share the coordinates between the two projects. So we do have two separate projects that we're working with, and we're going to use the coordinate system for the topography project and sort of push those out to the house project so that anytime we're working on these things, they're both kind of synchronized between the two, because we started with two separate ones and we just need to bring them together. The way we're going to do that is we're going to go to the Manage tab, we're going to drop down the coordinate tool, and we're going to say Publish Coordinates. The next step, of course, is to select the project that you're going to use as the source. So in this case, the project that we're going to link the current project to and push the coordinates out to. So we're going to actually select the house in this case. And then this is going to pop up, and the one that is highlighted is the one we're going to use. So we really don't have to do anything here. We're just going to click OK. At this point, it's a good idea to go ahead and click Save. And what that's going to do is it's going to save the current project, but it's also going to save that new position out to the house project that you're linked in. Okay, so now that we have our new topo inserted into our project, we've created this from a CAD file, and as you can tell, just looking at it, we've got a little bit of a problem because the existing topography doesn't quite match the house. And as we spin around this thing, you can see that the situation gets even worse around the back, which means we have a little bit of work to do. Before we get started on just modifying the existing topography, just remember one thing: the existing ground surface is useful information. We need to know what we have, and we need to retain that. A lot of work was put into collecting that data through surveying and other methods. And so what we really want to do is create a copy of that topo surface. Now Revit has sort of an ingenious way of doing that. It uses something called a graded region. You can see that button right up here in the ribbon. And what a graded region does is it automatically makes a copy, but it puts it in a different phase. And I'll talk more about phase in the part 2 video, but basically phasing is a way to keep track of existing stuff and new construction. So the new stuff obviously is the stuff that the contractor is most interested in. They need to know kind of what needs to be done going forward, but also we need to be able to differentiate between the stuff that's already there. That plays into renovation projects, additions, things like that for buildings, but we're going to be using it with the topography for this example. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by creating that separate topography by clicking on the graded region. And when we click on that graded region, it's going to give us this option. Do we want to create a new topography exactly like the existing one? And the answer is yes. The other option would be to just create it based on the perimeter points only. We would probably only use that one if we intend to make changes across the entire topography. But we're going to go ahead and go with this one. And the next thing that it's asking for is to select an existing topo solid for grading. So we have to click on this one in the very next step. So what we're getting now is a preview of that new topo surface, but what I'd like to do is just sort of click modify at this point to get back to our original view here. Now let's talk about phasing and how we control the visibility of the different phases. Right now, if you look down at the bottom of your properties window, you can see there's a phase filter and there's also a current phase setting. You can see that our current phase is set to new construction, which means that we would be able to see everything that is planned for the construction of a project. If the phase was set to prior, let's go ahead and just take a look at the other options here. If the phase was set to existing, we would no longer be able to see the future plans, right? The things that are going to happen in the new construction phase. But we're going to leave it on new construction for now. The other thing is the phase filter, which also gives you some options of combos. So in some cases you would want to see multiple phases all at once, or you might want to see everything overlapping one another. So I'm going to just switch that to show all for now. And it updates, but you really can't see anything happen. And then I'm just going to do a crossing window selection of this topo surface. And you can see right here that I have 2 topo solids selected. Okay, so let's just click on one of those. When I click on just one of them, I can look in the properties and see which one this is. And this happens to be the new construction, the one that we just created. Let's go ahead and tab select that now. If we tap tab and then hit it again, you look over here and it says phase demolished, new construction. So this is, the phase demolished is none. I'm sorry, so this one actually, the phase demolished is so this is the new construction one. Okay, sorry about that. When we say phase demolished, we mean what phase is this thing going to undergo a change, whether it's demolished or modified or whatever. So let's go back to the other one. We actually want to change the phase of that one. If I tab select and click, for this one where it says phase demolished new construction, we want to change this new construction to existing. That was what was there when we first got to the project. This is going to make it a lot easier to tell the difference between the 2 different topos that we have. So a simple selection in this case is going to pull up the new construction one. This is going to be the one that is going to show the work that we're going to do, the topography. This is the one that we're going to want to edit. The other one, when we tab select, this is the existing topography that we don't want to change. The reason it becomes important to retain both is because a lot of times we're going to show either both overlapping each other in the plan set, or we're going to show them on separate sheets, one showing the before and one showing the after, just so the grading contractor knows exactly what to do. To simplify things, sometimes it's a good idea to use our hide tools to just hide the one that we're not going to be working on. That would be the existing one. So I'm going to, again, tab select this topography until I get the existing one to show up, and then I'm just simply going to right click on it, hide in view, element. Now don't hide the category or both of them will get hidden. Now I know that anytime I click on this thing in the 3D view, I'm clicking on the one that I want to edit. I should probably do that in my site plan view also, because I'm also going to be working on this thing in plan view. So I'm going to go ahead and select this topo surface and see which one it is. You can see that this is the new one. So I'm going to tab select. So I get the old one, the existing one, and I'll go ahead and hide this in this view as well. All right. So now that I've gone through that, somewhat confusing explanation of what we're doing with those phases, I can set about editing this topo surface. So the first thing I need to know is, how do I want to edit the topo surface, right? So I'm going to switch back to my 3D view, and I'm just going to kind of spin around to the front. We're going to do the front first, and then we'll go ahead and attack the back. You can see that the topography, it's a little bit hard to see. I'm going to go ahead and switch to a shaded view. You can see that the topo comes up to about 6 inches below the top of the foundation wall. Now maybe we want to bring that up a little bit closer around the front where the garage is, because we're going to put maybe a slab on there. If we're going to draw a slab right over the top of the topography, which we're going to talk about in part 2 video, we would want to run it all the way up so it's even with the top. But we're going to just keep it maybe an inch or two below the top of that slab right there. And so I need to figure out what is the elevation at that point. And I have actually a pretty handy tool that's going to help me with that elevation. This comes in handy for a lot of things, but especially stuff like this. On the Annotate tab, we have a tool called Spot Elevation. You may have seen that before, but this is how it works. You basically start the tool and then you just hover over any point on this model, and it's going to tell you the elevation, the actual elevation of that thing. So you can see that my elevation, yours will be a little bit different, but the elevation of the top of my foundation here is 134, 5 3/4. If I want to bring it down, maybe just say 2 inches, I might go 132 and 6 inches. Just kind of keep it simple, 132.5 feet if you want to think about it that way. So I'm going to write that number down, 132.5. You should write yours down. And then we know what elevation we want this ground to hit along the front of the house. I'm going to probably want to bring that down a little bit right here because I'm going to want this thing to slope away from the house anyway. Plus, I generally, especially where parts of the house where I have a basement, I want that site work, I want that that ground plane to be at least 6 inches below the top of the foundation. So I'm going to go ahead and just write down another number, and I'm going to keep this one simple, 128. So again, take the elevation of the top of your foundation and subtract at least 6 inches from it for the remaining portion of that ground plane. Okay, so now that we know that, let's go ahead and go back to our site plan and we can start modifying this surface a little bit. To change the shape of a topography, what we need to do is add points. And these points are going to be given a 3D, three-dimensional, 3-axis location in space. And all we have to do is really edit the existing topo to really visualize that. So if we select the topo and then click Modify Sub-Elements, you can see that there are a number of shape handles around the perimeter and across the middle. And each one of these is assigned an elevation above 0. So this is an absolute 132 feet of elevation at this point right here. At any point, I can actually edit that and change it, but just remember that that is going to modify the overall surface and all of the kind of like surrounding area around that one point. But to gain control over how specifically that ground plane is going to meet our foundation, we actually need to add points along the surface or along the face of our building. And so we can get quite accurate control over exactly where that's going to meet the foundation just simply by adding enough points around the face of it and then assigning those points to a specific elevation, which we've already determined what they're going to be. On mine it's 128 around most of it and 132.5 around the just in front of the garage here. So you should have your numbers ready to go. The unfortunate thing about Revit 2024 and presumably future versions is that during this editing topo operation, we can't snap to these reference planes for whatever reason. The previous versions you could, now we can't. So unfortunately we have one more step that we have to do so that we can snap to those, and that would be to add detail lines. These are just going to be temporary lines that we're going to put in with the intention of deleting them when we're all done. Now sometimes it's easier to hide other things, but if you zoom in close enough, you can find that snap point. We're just going to kind of continue around with this thing until we get the entire perimeter taken care of. So I'm going to pause the video and just kind of do this on my own time, and then we'll meet back up when I'm done. Okay, so there you have it. I've basically traced all of my reference planes, so I have the perimeter of my foundation already marked out on there. I have something I can snap to and select. At this point, sometimes it makes sense to just hide the geometry that you don't need. In this case, we have a Revit file that's linked into the model. I am going to just hide that right now, and I could just, maybe actually a better option would be to hide it temporarily. So I'm going to hide element, and now I can see that perimeter a lot easier. Next step is going to be to select the topo surface, and you can either click Modify Sub-Elements or just simply Add Point. And another thing that Revit did, unfortunately, in this year, and maybe I just haven't quite figured out the best way to handle it, but we used to be able to, in the options bar, enter the desired elevation, and then any point we create at that point will change to that. But for now, it's basically just defaulting to this, whatever the surface is. So we're just going to go ahead and add these points across the front to start, and then we'll go back and we'll change them after we're done. So you'll notice I'm just picking at each corner of the foundation, and there I'm done with that. Now I do have to reselect, click Modify Sub-Elements, and now I can go through and I can select each one of these points. It's a little hard to see, but if you Control select these points, it's actually not giving me any place I can enter that elevation. So it's looking like they've made this way more cumbersome than it needs to be, or I'm just not understanding the new method. But if you pick one at a time, you can actually change these things. And remember, I said I was going to go 128 on all of these. So I'll go ahead and just change them one at a time. You should be doing the same on yours. Remember these last two, I decided that I wanted those at 132.5. Okay, now I'm going to click Modify. I'm going to go back and take a look at this thing in 3D and hope that everything worked out the way that it was supposed to, and it certainly did not. Okay, so I've got a problem. Let's see if I can figure out what that is. And it's real obvious now to me what I did wrong. I subtracted 4 feet instead of 4 inches from all of those. So I'm just going to go back and I'm going to, looks like I need to maybe make an adjustment here as well. It looks like that's a little bit low. So let me go back through and take a look at those elevations and see if I can make this look a little bit better. Okay, so it looks like I was just hurrying and trying to talk while I was thinking in it. That wasn't working very good for me. So let's go back to the spot elevation. I apologize for the mix-up, but this is 134'5". Don't subtract feet when you're trying to subtract inches. Okay, good user tip. We're actually looking for 134'3", maybe, just to come down a little bit. So 134'3". If you caught that when I was saying it originally, congratulations, and I apologize for the frustration. So I'm going to change the ones across the front to 134'3", and the ones across the front of the house to 133'7". That sounds a whole lot better. So just back to site plan, and you can, nice thing about Revit of course is that you can adjust these things infinitely. We'll select this, click modify sub elements, and I can just go back through and fix all of these. Okay, I've got all those fixed, I think. Let's go back to a 3D view. And yeah, that looks a whole lot better. So you'll notice that it does do a little funky thing across the front here. It kind of dips down a little bit. It's basically finding a happy medium between the points you create and the existing topography. And so you don't always get a clean line from one point to the next, as you can see here. So in those cases, if you really want to flatten it out, you may add one more point kind of where it's dipping down, and that should straighten it right out. But if we look across the rest of the front of the house, you can see that it actually kind of worked out pretty good with that new elevation that I put in there. Okay, so that's kind of how this works, and we can kind of continue that process all the way around. I'm going to go ahead and play around with these points along the back. I have a stepping foundation on this particular house. Yours might be also. So my goal is to get that topography kind of up closer to this door, and then have it just sort of gradually slope down and follow that stepping to flatten it out at the back. You can see on mine there's a walkout basement right down here. So I definitely want that topography down at the bottom below that door, certainly below whatever patio I might put out there, just to make sure that that works the way it's supposed to. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Pause the video recording, and then we'll come back on the other side. So I've gone ahead and created a bunch of points across the back. You can see I put in, I think, yeah, five points to define the back. And I can certainly add more points if I need more control over what that's doing. I also didn't do any additional points on the sides. I'm just going to kind of plan on just a straight slope from one point to the next. But again, I can add additional points, and I probably will, just to kind of control what that looks like a little bit more. So let's go ahead and switch to a 3D view. At this point, it really is sort of a function of trial and error. But you can edit all of these points in 3D, and sometimes that's easier on a complicated situation like this. So we just select the surface, edit, and then click on Modify Sub-Elements. And then one by one, we'll just kind of play around with some different elevations. This one, I'm going to go ahead and go back to my default of 133'7". In fact, yeah, we'll just do that. And we can watch in real time what that does. So if I decide, you know, well, maybe I want that up a little bit higher for whatever reason, I can certainly alter that at this point. Let's go ahead and change this one as well. And I'm going to just use the same, kind of a similar thing. Maybe I'll come down a little bit and just make this one 132. Oops, that's not what I wanted. So 133 maybe would be a good one for that. We'll just kind of work our way across the back here, editing points one at a time. Okay, so you can see that I've got this down below the foundation. In most cases, I probably need a little bit more tweaking. You'll also notice, though, that I have this giant trough coming in here. So probably in this scenario, what I would want to do to make this ground surface a little bit more usable is maybe excavate a lot more of this out, at least right outside the patio here where my walkout is. I might also decide that, now that I have this in here, I might decide, maybe I want to redo this whole foundation. Maybe I want it to slope a lot more along the side and just run this whole back wall as a framed wall, maybe even do a little bit of a retaining wall right here to kind of hold that back and make that backyard a lot more usable. Because the slope is so steep, it wouldn't be too bad of an idea to kind of excavate all the way out level. It would just give you a lot more usable yard. So just kind of throwing around some different scenarios and introducing some of the thought processes in determining what you want to do. We're talking about how to do it, of course, but also we want to mix in there a little bit of kind of what you might want to do in this situation. Similarly, we might want to take another look at the front yard. You can see that the slope is coming down pretty quickly toward the foundation. This is obviously going to create a problem for us. When it rains, we don't want that water coming down and pouring into our foundation. We always want some positive drainage away from our house, at least a few feet. So you could either come in here and edit these existing points and or create some additional points across the front just to kind of create that swale so that the water comes down and it's diverted around the house rather than flowing right up to it. But we will leave that to you, how much you want to play around with that. I would recommend you spend most of your time playing around with the topo surface that you create for your house. And just keeping in mind that you can go with a flat, completely flat surface if you want to. If that's what you want to build your house on. Certainly acceptable to do that. This one will definitely provide you a little bit more learning, and it'll make your final project a little more interesting to look at in the renderings. One final thought, I just wanted to demonstrate what the difference would be then between the different phases, and we'll look at that a little bit more on the next video. But for now, let's go ahead and just peek at this. We're going to reset all of the temporary hide. We're going to unhide the topo surface in this view that we have hidden. And it doesn't look like I'm clicking the right one. Tab select. There it is. Okay, so now you can see both surfaces at once. The red obviously is the existing in this case, and then the dark color is the new stuff, the stuff that we carved away. So that kind of gives you a visual of the work that we did on this thing. Looks a lot better now that we've modified it a little bit. But even just in that short amount of time, we can make a big difference on what that topo looks like. And it's fairly straightforward, a little bit complicated, but once you get over that initial hump, I'm sure you guys will be doing just fine with it. Don't forget to go back and delete those detail lines that we created. Those were just temporary. But other than that, I think we're all set. And if you have any questions, obviously reach out. Until then, we'll see you guys next time in class.